Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, Is There a Future for Fossil Energy?, organized by the Energy Transition Initiative at NTNU, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. My name is Ruth Astrid Sæther, and I have the pleasure of guiding us through today's program, which I hope will be both inspiring and thought-provoking. This is the second webinar in a series of 5. These 5 webinars are replacing the Physical Energy Transition Conference, which was supposed to take place in Trondheim in March. However, the corona pandemic made it difficult, yes, even impossible to do so. We are all the more pleased to see that so many of you are joining us here today and in the series of the webinars, and I do hope that you will take active part in the discussions as well. And the way to do that is to use Slido. And Slido works like this, and I think we're going to have on screen now a tiny how to do it in 4 steps. So you can use your smartphone or a tablet or even your computer, and you can get online, and then you have to write in slido.com and you enter the event code, and today's code is 41647, and we're going to repeat that during the webinar. In this forum that you're entering now, you can comment and ask questions, and the most important feature here is the like button. It is there to enhance the relevance of the questions. If you see that someone has already written down something that resembles your own question, please just click like. It saves you the time to write, and it helps me out not having to read, more or less several versions of the same question or argument. And you could also put a name to the question that you're asking, who you're actually forwarding to, or you can mark it to the debate or the panel discussion. And I'm going to do my very best to convey your questions and comments to the speakers as we go along. Now, today we will have 6 presentations with a short Q&A session after each speech. Then, once we've heard all 6, we're going to gather the speakers in a panel for a discussion, concluding at the latest at 4 p.m. Central European Standard Time. So please feel free to be active in the forum. This is, after all, for you. In the first webinar that we had in May, entitled The World in Crisis, the speakers made it pretty clear that we, as a global community, are far away from reaching the Paris Agreement goals. Sorry. The greenhouse gas emissions are nowhere near the level they should be at, and the energy transition is not happening fast enough. So what do we do about that? And what is the role of fossil fuels in this landscape? Our first speaker today is Dr. Bysveen, Chief Market Developer at Sintef Energy Research in Trondheim, Norway. With her background, where research on environmental energy, transport technologies, and CCS has been combined with experience from the oil and gas industry, she's well placed to draw the big picture for us and give us some first reflections on the future of fossil fuels. So I wonder, how do we ensure a just transition? I'm going to leave the digital floor to you, Bysveen.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I will start by saying some words about where we are now, then continuing elaborating around the issue of sustainability, then a few words about just energy transition, and then going on to focusing on the energy system flexibility before I finalize with some words around the fact that carbon management is urgently needed. I would like to share some of these main questions with you before I continue. What would be the lowest cost route to Paris? If we do not select the lowest cost route, who should pay for that? A second thought could be, are we aiming for the largest possible share of the world population having access to electricity? A third one would be, Do we want the largest possible share of renewables? Why is that? And should that be as soon as possible? And a possible last one could be, should there be a largest possible focus on the consumer? And why is that? And at what cost for the society? Where are we now? This illustrates Paris and the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report on global warming, the 1.5 degree report is an important scientific background for my talk. Having that as an important basis, I would state that while we are waiting, CO2 is accumulating, big cuts are needed, and they are needed urgently. If we see this graph and having net zero by 2050, of course, obviously, we need deep reductions of CO2. And we even need to have removal of CO2. That is both stated in this report. And I believe it's important to take that strongly into consideration. What about sustainability? Well, sustainability are many things, but in this context, I would like to point to a few of them. The fact that resources in general are limited. Is it possible to use fossil resources in a sustainable way? And maybe asking the question, is it sustainable not to use fossil resources if that could be used in a sustainable way? And I would also like to point towards the fact about social fairness. So focusing on facts then, before feelings, I would like to draw your attention to my next slide. And that is around how to measure sustainability. And I would like to show in that context this technical report from the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. So the EU taxonomy, it's actually a list of economic activities which are classified based on their contribution to the EU sustainability goals. And at the same time, do no significant harm criteria have been used to other environmental objectives. It will enable capital markets to identify sustainable investment opportunities. And just to mention before I continue, carbon capture and storage, CCS, qualifies as a taxonomy eligible sector. And it states if it enables that primary activity to operate in compliance with the threshold, for example, steel, cement, and electricity production. And this report also considers the importance of CCS to scale up hydrogen production and to decarbonize in general. This is an illustration of this. If you see sustainable investments in the middle and for investors, this taxonomy will help the investors to take greater consideration of the investors' sustainability preferences. And a healthy planet will be easier to ensure with less economic harm caused by increased weather-related damage, as examples. Getting on to my next point, which is related to the social fairness part of sustainability, and this is the issue of the so-called just transition. As a major part of the European Green Deal, the issue of just transition is important. It is important to make sure that, and I would like to quote the Just Transition Commission, the report from the Scottish Commission, where they say that the imperative of a just transition is that governments design policies in a way that ensures the benefits of climate change, actions that those are shared widely, while the costs do not unfairly burden those least able to pay, or whose livelihoods are directly or indirectly at risk as the economy shifts and changes. To the right, you see guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. This is by the International Labour Organization. In the discussion around whether or not to use or use fossil fuels, these aspects are important. And I just mentioned the examples of Eastern Europe, how to deal with the transition from coal-based economies, and the same for the oil and gas industries. My main next point is related to the importance of having a future flexible energy system, for that system to be climate friendly and to be built for the future, so to say. This is an illustration showing different energy carriers, electricity, gases, heat, liquids and solids, as well as energy storage. It's easy to understand that this system is complex, and it's important to not look at one energy vector at a time, but to understand that this complexity is important, and that the flexibility, increased flexibility of this system will be really important. And one very important tool, I would say, to increase this flexibility is the technology that I like to call carbon management, or CCS. It's also mentioned as CCUS, where you consider using the CO2 not for permanent storage, but for other uses. Well, this technology could actually decarbonize major parts of the industry. For some part of the industry, it's the only option to decarbonize. It will also enable negative emissions, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, for example, through the biogenic part of waste to energy and biomass in general. It will also enable the hydrogen economy. I mean, you can take the methane, for example, and you have the carbon and you have the hydrogen splitted, and by that you actually do decarbonize. And that hydrogen can be used for several things, like heating and cooling. You can change from heating by natural gas, for example, over to hydrogen. You can decarbonize transport by using hydrogen, and you could also use it for energy storage. By that, CCS can decarbonize industry, enable negative emissions, and enable the hydrogen economy at the same time. Another way of putting this is shown in this picture. You see that using, for example, natural gas resources plus CCS, you can produce hydrogen for all these different sectors. Here is another illustration of the same fact, having different feedstocks, using CCS, and having this solving the decarbonizing problem of different sectors. The IPCC report states actually that limiting the energy sector emissions without CCS would increase the cost of climate mitigation by 138%. Another place in it states, many models could not limit likely warming to below 2 degrees if bioenergy, CCS and their combination are limited. This slide is about the importance of selecting solutions based on your CO2 emissions reductions goal. I have one example here showing that if you aim for a certain reductions by 2050, this is UK, 60%, CCS is not considered to be part of the solution. It will be too costly for that goal. If the goal is 80% reduction, which is in this context needed to reaching the Paris Agreement, well, CCS is strongly needed. So what does this sum up to? Well, there are some dilemmas, and I would obviously state first the climate crisis. In addition, we need to secure energy supply, and I would also like to mention the importance of fuel poverty. Any continent would like to increase its financial competitiveness. But please, let's focus on the difference between what is important now in the transition period and in the future. For energy, this is important. I also mentioned the issue of job security and the issue of environmental concerns in general. And I would like to point to a few ones. One on the wind farms, and as an example, and wildfires as an example of natural storage of CO2, which is actually, it shows that how important it is to have permanent storage underground as an alternative to storing the carbon in trees, for example. And finally, the availability of resources. We do have fossil energy resources, and they could be used in a sustainable way. And then finally, I like to make the comments. Some people would like to only invest in 100% renewables. I would like to pose the question, why is that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the first question I would like to ask you, because you were saying that CCS or CCUS, as we call it as well, will be part of the solution. It's got a huge potential. And for the last 5 years, I've heard people talking about CCS as part of the future solution. And I'm just wondering, is this a mature technology now? I mean, do we really see results of all the research that we've done so far into this area?
Thank you for that question. Keep getting that question. It's a good one. There are many reasons for this, I would say, but of course the obvious lack of business models is an explanation. And as long as it's more or less free to vent the CO2 to the atmosphere, why spend a lot of investment money on it? But the question around research and maturity, it's definitely a mature technology in the sense that you have off-the-shelf technology, and at the same time, in order to make it economically viable, of course you need to reduce costs and increase reliability and so forth. But the short answer is yes, it's doable and it's ready.
Yeah, and in the audience there are people who are, would really like to talk more about CCS, and actually we're coming back to her afterwards, but I'm going to ask one of her questions already. It's Franziska Holz. You're going to meet her later on. She's one of the experts today. I'm going to explain all about that in 2 minutes. But since she has a very popular question, I'm going to pop it to you right now. So if CCS is a promising solution, why have so few companies engaged in it yet? Could it be with what you were just saying about the market not being ready, or is it other things?
Yes, I mean, we should look at the drivers, what drives this, and one could just imagine what would have happened with the Energiewende in Germany if it were not for the extreme amount of public money put on the table to make it happen. So I think it's a little bit about looking into the realities, and I would say that the story about PV, I would not be surprised if you see the same history for CCS actually. It was a lot about public money being put on the table. No one saw that the price reductions happening that fast. I don't see any reason why this should not happen for CCS.
Good. I think we can come back to, I guess CCS is going to be part of the panel discussion later on. So I'm going to save some of the questions. So dear audience, don't worry. I will be keeping these questions and we'll be looking at them and copying them and everything, because now I would like to introduce a feature which is pretty permanent, I think, in these transition conferences. For those who are familiar with the transition conference, energy transition conference from previous years, you will probably recognize this. It is the expert panel. To me, it looks like they're operating in a form of a thesis defense almost. And today's webinar is no exception. So I hope, Maria, that you're ready to be interrogated by our two experts. I'm going to introduce them first, and we'll see if both of them wish to ask you questions. Now, they both work and live in Germany, and they are both economists with a particular interest in energy economics. Another thing they have in common is that they are both members of the International Advisory Board of this conference. He established the Institute for Future Energy Consumer Needs and Behavior at the RWTH Aachen University in 2007. He's now on the screen, whereas she, who's already been there for a couple of seconds, is deputy head of the
Not in a technologically neutral fashion.
and environment at the German Institute of Economic Research, DIW Berlin. And in addition to that, she's an adjunct professor at the NTNU in Trondheim. We're of course talking about Franziska, Holz and Reinhard Madlener. And I see them like that and there, yeah. You might see them otherwise. They are now both on screen. And I would like to know, dear experts, who wants to go first? And you're not obliged to ask all the speakers questions, both of you, but as far as I can tell, I know that you like to ask questions, so go ahead. Who wants to go first? Is it going to be Reinhard? I know that you, amongst others, are looking at economics of technical change, so CCS, maybe that could be part of it, or is it Franziska? The floor is yours. Go ahead.
I would give the lady the first shoot, if you like.
Okay. So now Ruth already asked my biggest question, let's say, and I'm sure that we will talk about CCS a little more.
10% this year.
Concerning me, and I guess Marie just touched up on that a little bit with the just transition question, is really the long-term question of what will happen to resource-rich countries and therefore growing revenues if eventually we talk about decarbonization and not future use of fossil fuels with CCS. And maybe you can give us already a little bit of insights from Norway, since you are in a fossil fuel country.
Just to make sure that I understand your question, you are asking the role of CCS RNI, or maybe you could.
No, my question is rather: is there sort of a plan B if you have less revenues at some point from oil and gas
yes.
in the country?
Yeah. Well, that's all the numbers these days tells us that that will be the situation if we don't, at least if you don't change the plans towards producing hydrogen from natural gas, for example. So definitely the oil and gas situation in Norway is something that is now extremely important to debate, and in that my main point is related to how can we make use of these resources in a sustainable way also in the future. And of course for Norway then the possibility of producing hydrogen and storing the CO2 underground is an extremely, let's say, it's an option we want to investigate, of course, but not let's say just in order to secure our future revenues, but that's obviously a part of it, an important part of it, I would say.
Reinhard, do you feel like asking a question, or did you want to follow up, Franziska?
No, I can, if I may, I would ask another question.
Go ahead.
I'm glad, Marie, that you touched upon two issues. One is the fuel poverty and justice debate, and the other one is the financing debate. Last year, I had the pleasure to contribute a book called Energy and Inequality, and I was the only economist, and I had to think hard, what can I contribute to that discussion? It's about distributional issues. But what struck me is how on earth can we measure justice, and how can we agree globally on what is just? Even the definition of fuel poverty is very hard to define, and take a measure and you get a different result.
Yes.
So that's my first question. Yeah. How would you go about in a more practical and pragmatic way to deal with this justice and poverty debate, given that we have to think globally and act locally?
I wish I could say that I'm an expert on social sciences and humanities, in addition to my background as a mechanical engineer, but I'm not. my answer would be kind of may have limited value, but based on my understanding, the role of social sciences and humanities is very important in understanding how this can be done, how this can be measured. But I would one of the reasons for me showing the taxonomy report is actually related to the issue of measurability, to put it that way, because there is a lot of hard work being put into finding how to measure different things and to measure it as sustainable. But when it comes to this just transition thing, I would just like to mention the fact that in the context of the European Green Deal, you are certainly aware that there are national just transition commissions being put in place across ministries in the different countries to investigate this, to discuss what is it and how can we measure it and how can we make sure that the transition is just. So that is, at least in Europe, you does this on member state level in addition to on the European level. But I would be more than happy in understanding more how this can be measured. And unfortunately, I don't have any good answers to that.
I mean, I've seen country indicator schemes, and this immediately leads to some kind of subjectivity, that who defines the indicator has a lot of control about the results. And at the end, we have some lists, some rankings, like benchmarks for 190 countries, which country is getting more just and less poor.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there is little agreement, and this is a very subtle topic, justice and fuel poverty, that's very perceived. It's not so easy to do this as an annual benchmarking exercise. And apart from,
yeah, sorry,
I saw a main problem in that we tend to look at our national boundaries when we define energy policy, including energy fuel poverty policy. But it's so much more intertwined globally. We have a globalized economy. When we consume, we have global implications with our consumption patterns. That all has implications on poverty in some other countries we might not even be aware of. So acting is difficult and benchmarking is difficult as well, but I agree, justice and poverty are very important factors when we want to decarbonize the world.
Now, dear experts and first presenter, I have to stop you there because now you're actually entering the big debate, and we're going to have a panel discussion towards the end, and we have to move forward. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Marie so far. We're going to meet you again later on, and also to Franziska and Reinhard for good questions. So now these three are going to be off camera again. We'll meet them later, but now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Laszlo Varro is chief economist at the International Energy Agency, and since 1977, the IEA has provided the global society with analysis and insights on trends in energy demand and supply through its flagship publication, amongst others, the World Energy Outlook. Now, we're going to get a brief summary on how the IEA and their chief economist consider the role of fossil fuel during the energy transition on the global scale. Will we ever manage without coal, for instance? And how important will oil and gas be in the years to come? If you have other questions, continue to use Slido code 41647. You're already there, so that's good. But first, Laszlo Varro, the scene is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you a brief oversight of how do we see the role of fossil fuels during the coronavirus crisis and also during the ongoing energy transition. So fossil fuels represent today over 80% of the global energy consumption, and this ratio actually hardly changed in the past several decades. The rapid growth of renewables primarily compensated for the decline in the share of nuclear power. Now, 2020 is an unprecedented shock, with all fossil fuels having registering their largest consumption decline since the Second World War. Unsurprisingly, oil is the most seriously affected, because during the coronavirus crisis, governments intentionally constrained mobility in order to stop the spread of the virus. And the mobility, the transportation sector today is critically dependent on oil supply. Interestingly enough, coal is not being used in the transport sector. Global coal demand in percentage terms declines almost as much as global oil demand. And the reason for this is that coal faces the perfect storm of very weak electricity consumption all across the world due to the recession and the industrial shutdowns, and extremely cheap natural gas prices. So within a shrinking marketplace of falling demand, natural gas managed to take market share from coal. Coal demand declines significantly more than natural gas. The recession and low fossil fuel prices affects investment very significantly, but not in a technologically neutral fashion. Oil and gas upstream investment declines by around 32% this year. In financial terms, that's over $200 billion. In fact, oil and gas upstream investment this year is more or less in line with the residual investment need of an energy transition trajectory. Even under very strong climate policies, oil and gas does not disappear overnight. So even if the energy system is put on a well-diluted climate stabilization trajectory, this is the sustainable development scenario of the International Energy Agency, you still need some investment in oil and gas. And with the recession and low oil prices, the current investment is broadly in that level. We see a 12% decline in investment in energy efficiency. Improving energy efficiency is a critically important component of the energy transition, but this year it faces a very significant economic headwind, primarily from low gas prices, but also from the financial weakness of households and small businesses. Electricity investment also declines all around the world in practically every segment. Within the clean energy space, the 2020 witnesses a roughly 10% decline in renewable deployment. That is largely due to social distancing measures. So the most serious shock is in residential rooftop solar projects. There an intense personal interaction is needed. People need to go out and engage with the family who buys the solar panel on the rooftop, and that's difficult under social distancing. Now, on the positive side, we see a rapid rebound and a dynamic rebound of renewable investment. We also see an unbroken strong investor appetite for renewable projects. However, I should emphasize that the pre-crisis level of renewable deployment, which we hopefully will reach in 2021, was only slightly more than half of the renewable deployment that will be needed for the energy transition. So it is not enough to reach the pre-crisis level of renewable deployment because the pre-crisis level of renewable deployment overall failed to put the energy system on a climate transition trajectory. Now, while renewable electricity primarily affects gas and coal, the fuels that are used in power generation, for oil, the key technology is the electrification of the transport sector. We see a marginal increase of electric car sales this year, primarily driven by Europe, where the European Union's policies to promote electric car are increasingly effective. But I should mention that overall new car sales have been sharply declining this year. The world economy is in a deep recession, and people don't spend their money to buy an expensive new car, and they are terrified about losing their jobs. So a slight increase of electric car sales in an overall shrinking new car market is a major achievement and represents a substantial jump in the market share of electric vehicles. Now, overall, before the coronavirus crisis, with the policies that were stated by governments, the energy system was in a trajectory of almost stagnating global carbon dioxide emissions. We had enough innovation, enough efficiency improvement, and investment in clean energy technology to compensate for global population growth, industrialization, and urbanization in emerging economies. In order to get to a value 2 degrees climate stabilization, global carbon dioxide emissions would need to decline very sharply, eventually converging towards zero in the middle of the century. And you don't make a big mistake if you assume that three big things are needed: improving energy efficiency, deploying renewables, and all other technologies, including carbon capture and storage. So energy efficiency and renewables are not one among the many or two among the many. They play a uniquely important role, but we think that in order to have a cost-efficient and viable transition, a broad technology portfolio is needed. Now, when I overlay on the energy transition challenge the developments of this year, this very, very little blue arrow is the impact of the coronavirus crisis. So the coronavirus crisis leaves the climate challenge essentially unsolved. By 2025, in the Sustainable Development Trajectory, global carbon dioxide emissions will have to be lower than they are today. And next time, we will want to achieve that without shutting down the global economy. So there's still a massive scale investment challenge into clean energy and a massive scale innovation challenge into new low carbon technologies. Now, another thing I would touch upon is the social and behavioral impacts of the virus crisis. There has been a lively discussion on the possibility of people not returning to office, business travel replaced by video conferencing, home office replacing commuting. To a certain extent, this is happening. On the other hand, there is also an extremely important behavioral change, namely that there is a clear indication from cities that are reopening that people became reluctant to use public transport, and there is a significant shift from public transport to cars. In fact, we have been actually surprised by how rapidly global oil demand has been recovering in the past couple of weeks as economies have reopened. So we have to be careful not to assume that all the social and behavioral changes are on the positive side for sustainability. So overall, for both oil and gas, they do not disappear overnight, but a well-below 2 degrees climate stabilization trajectory puts them on a structural decline. In the case of oil, in a sustainable development pathway, global oil demand by the mid-20s declines by over 1 million barrels per day. In third of the decline is electric cars, 1/3 is the improving efficiency of internal combustion engines, and the remaining 1/3 is systemic shifts in the transport system, as for example, high-speed trains replacing aviation. In the case of natural gas, the glass is half full or half empty. Natural gas in Europe and the United States in the electricity sector is increasingly squeezed by renewables that are becoming cheaper and cheaper. But there is still a significant potential for coal to gas switch in Asia, which is currently dominated by coal. And also natural gas demand is remarkably resilient in both in industrial energy use and also in building heating. So overall, it declines considerably less than oil during the first decades of the transition. Now, the biggest transition challenge is still coal, even after the declines of 2020. There are over 2,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power generation capacity operating in the world. Almost half of that is outdated supercritical technology. And 2/3 of the generation capacity is in developing Asia. And in developing Asia, there was such a powerful investment wave into new coal plants in the past decade that overall around 1/3 of the coal-fired power generation capacity operating in the world today is less than 10 years old. That's not bad for a dying industry. In fact, if I take the already existing and under construction power plant fleet, so if I assume that nobody will ever decide anywhere in the world to build a new coal plant, and this is not the case, but even if I assume that, the existing and under construction plants still would have 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions mid-century because the fleet is quite young. And there is simply no carbon budget for unabated coal-fired power generation in this available to this trajectory. So these emissions will have to go down to zero. Now, we don't believe that there is a politically feasible pathway to a full coal phase out in Asia, because those coal plants play a uniquely important role in the energy security of the key economies of Asia. they run on a widely available geopolitical security primary fuel, and they support millions of jobs both in China and India. So we think that there will need to be a mixed strategy of repurposing coal-fired power plants to balance renewable energy, retrofitting them with carbon capture and storage, and there will be a fair amount of early decommissioning. But overall, a broad range of technologies will have to be applied to tackle emissions from the young coal plants of Asia. So this is how we see the future of fossil fuels, and thank you very much for the invitation again.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. That was at a pretty high speed, I would say. It would be interesting to see if the energy transition could go just as fast. So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And unfortunately, you won't be able to join us for the discussion later on. So I'm just going to call on our two experts right away. If they want to ask you a question or two, that this is the moment that they actually can do that. And meanwhile, I was just reflecting when you said things don't happen overnight. Oil and gas is not going to go away overnight. But at the same time, you showed us that the corona pandemic has actually had an impact on quite a lot of sectors. And, you know, when everything stops, that has an effect. Do you see any kind of similar radical change in the future that you could sort of work on when you're doing your analysis? You know, a bit like the pandemic that we've just experienced.
Of renewable investment.
Change like that.
So the coronavirus crisis overall triggered a roughly 8% reduction of global carbon dioxide emissions. And the price of that was several thousand people died, hundreds of thousands of people died, and millions of people lost their jobs. This was an emission reduction which is completely undesirable. We don't think it should be celebrated. And we don't see any realistic prospect of societies wanting to repeat this experience intentionally. So there's a very clear evidence from all around the world that people want to get their life back. They want to get back to work. They want to visit friends and family. They want to go out to restaurants and so on. So the measures that were implemented all around the world, they were unavoidable and necessary in the context of the healthcare crisis, but they are completely socially unsustainable as a decades-long strategy. So we think that the only way to do the energy transition is by innovation and investment. We don't believe that intentionally constraining global GDP is a viable approach. It is the carbon intensity of GDP which we have to decline in a radical fashion, and the way to do that is by investment and innovation.
Great, thank you. So now we have our two experts present. Do you have questions for Laszlo?
Well, Franziska, you want to go first?
Should we swap for a change and Reinhard start?
Reinhard can start, yes.
As you like. Yes, Laszlo, I have been a modeler myself for 30 years, so don't take the question wrong. My question is, how useful is this kind of scenario modeling at times of corona, where we have a black swan event, so to speak, of uncertain length, and we have also to face a white swan event, and we have to face black swan events sooner or later. So there is a lot of uncertainty that you probably cannot address in your models, and policymakers still rely a lot on such scenario analysis. What would be your self-critical comment on the limits of your types of model? For example, related to technological lockout. We have technological lock-in. You mentioned there is some infrastructure that should be replaced if we want to decarbonize, but that creates additional cost if relatively new infrastructure is being replaced by even more novel technology. That's cost, I think, is usually not modeled in such kind of models.
So let me quote General Eisenhower, who remarked after the Normandy invasion that he said that in my experience, plans are useless, but planning is essential. Of course, modeling the energy system does not predict the future. The future is by its nature unpredictable. However, governments have to make decisions. For example, Germany recently decided to focus the stimulus programs on electric vehicles and lock out internal combustion engine vehicles from the stimulus decision. I believe this was the right decision to make. I congratulate the German government for that. And also Germany decided to allocate significant stimulus funding to build up hydrogen production and the hydrogen infrastructure. I also think this is the right decision to make. But you need to have a comprehensive view of the energy system. So why Germany should focus on electric cars, or why this is the right time to allocate significant investments into the hydrogen infrastructure? So these questions cannot be answered without looking at the energy system. And of course, we need to be mindful of the possibility of rapid technological change. And we have been, and let me advertise in this respect that we soon coming out with a new energy technology perspectives, which will have a special focus on some potentially disruptive technologies in the field of electricity storage, electrochemistry, and other fields which can potentially change the energy trajectory quite significantly. However, there is also a significant evidence that energy technologies need a considerable amount of time and a strong policy support. Solar photovoltaics is often framed as a sudden surprise. People talk about how surprisingly rapid the ramp up of solar was. But solar panels were actually invented in 1957, and for 20 years they were so ridiculously expensive that they were used only on military satellites. So the success of solar of the past 5 years was not a sudden surprise coming from nothing. It came after several decades of patient R&D and innovation funding, primarily by the national laboratories of the United States, and also a multi-billion euro investments primarily by Germany to enable the learning by doing. So in this respect, the energy system does have a very significant momentum, and new technologies require a very careful policy and infrastructure development to have a major impact. And we think that system modeling, you have to be modest, of course, and you have to be skeptical, but system modeling does play an important role in guiding policy.
I will have to stop you there, Laszlo, for a minute. Franziska, did you want to ask Laszlo a question, a quick one?
Yeah, I think mine is quick. My question really is, you said that natural gas lost much less than coal in the last months. And I wonder if you think this is a sustainable trend, a long-term trend that we started on there, or if it's just really a temporary picture.
No, we definitely say that this is a sustainable trend. One is that 2019 was the all-time history on a timely transition liquefied natural gas facilities. Global gas markets were abundantly supplied already before the coronavirus crisis. So we expect a substantial period of very abundantly supplied global natural gas markets and the associated low gas prices. And also in both Europe and in the United States, the coal plant is aging and is being decommissioned in an irreversible fashion. And last but not least, the measures that the financial system implemented in constraining coal plant financing has become quite effective. So in the past 3 years, new investment is still taking place in new coal plants, but in just 3 years, it declined by 2/3. And one major reason for this is that it became increasingly challenging to secure project financing for a coal project.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laszlo, for joining us here today. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, you won't have the chance to participate in our panel discussion later on because you have another meeting that you have to go to. But we're very happy that you took the time to come here today and to elaborate a bit further. And I'm sure we could have spoken to you and with you for a couple of hours more if we had the chance. So thank you very much to you. And also, once again, to Franziska and Reinhard, which we will be seeing again soon. So how is the future of fossil energy looking from within the oil and gas industry? It is time to find out, as we are about to lend ears to Anders Opedal, Executive Vice President at Equinor. His responsibility covers technology, projects and drilling, a rather large portfolio, in other words. You may still ask him questions, and the code is 41647. You can also see that in the chat function at GoToWebinar. So, Anders Opedal, how will Equinor contribute to the energy transition? The floor is yours.
The world is changing at a great pace, but still the world needs energy, lots of it and more. At the same time, emissions must come down, and it must happen fast. Equinor is developing as a broad energy company to be competitive in a low-carbon future. That's why we take pride in opening a world-class field like Johan Sverdrup. That's why we are ready to invest in huge offshore wind projects like Empire Wind and Dogger Bank. That's why we are developing solutions to capture CO2 and produce emissions-free hydrogen. New technologies and digital solutions play instrumental roles in all of them. Now, we are stepping up our climate response with higher ambitions in Norway and across the world. And to realize all of this, we are working together with our partners, suppliers, and the societies we are a part of. Because together, we can achieve so much more than alone. Tomorrow will look different than today, but the transition also holds opportunities. We are well placed to act on this and continue to turn natural resources into energy for people and progress for society.
Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on where in the world you're participating from. I hope you're all safe and healthy, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. The Energy Transition Initiative at NTNU started as a joint strategic effort between NTNU and Equinor. To us, this is a valuable initiative where NTNU and other top international experts join forces to advise around policies, strategies, and technologies for the transitions we are facing. We don't have all the answers, so events like this webinar are important to learn more about other organization solutions to the climate crisis. According to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the next 10 years are really critical to avoid the worst impact of climate change. A 50% cut in the greenhouse gas emission the next decade is required to keep the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius on pre-industrial times. Changing the global and complex energy system will take time, but it's a solvable challenge, and we must solve it together. The industry, governments, companies, and consumers, we all play a part. Today, more than 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and more than 50% from oil and gas. Equinor provides energy to almost 200 million people around the world. In order to transform our energy system, we need a transition away from fossil fuels, but also a transition within fossil energy. And Equinor is committed to take part in both transitions. Equinor's strategy is clear: always safe, high value, low carbon. We are developing as a broad energy company, leveraging the strong synergies between oil, gas, renewable, CCUS, and hydrogen. And we recently launched our climate ambitions to reduce our own greenhouse gas emission and to shape our portfolio in line with the Paris Agreement. We aim to reduce the net carbon intensity of energy we produce over its full life cycle by at least 50% by 2050. And in Norway, our ambition is to reduce the absolute greenhouse gas emission from our operated offshore fields and onshore plants towards near zero by 2050. In Equinor, we have been working with the CO2 reducing measures for many years. So let me today give you some examples. Troll A was the first platform on the Norwegian continental shelf with power from shore since the field started up in 1996. Since then, new technology has enabled us to install power from shore on several fields. And from 2022, a total of 10 fields will receive power through the Utsira High area solution. This solution will contribute to an average reduction in CO2 emission equal to emission from almost 600,000 cars per year. The next new technology milestone is Hywind Tampen. The project was approved by the Norwegian authorities in April and will be the world's first floating wind farm to power offshore oil and gas platforms when it starts producing in 2022. And since the early 2000s, Equinor has proactively addressed ways of cutting emissions from supply vessels offshore Norway. Viking Energy was the first LNG-fueled vessel in Equinor's fleet in 2003, and the first vessel with hybrid battery power in 2016. And from 2024, it may become the first supply vessel in the world covering long distance fueled by pure carbon-free ammonia. The work will be an important contribution to reaching Equinor's maritime climate ambition launched earlier this month, to contribute to reduce emission together with the maritime industry in Norway and internationally. To reduce the emission even more in the future, we will also need new technology and operational game changers. We are developing a concept called Equinor's subsea shuttle to transport CO2 and oil in a big subsea drone with no emissions. Still in its early days, but it's a good example on how we must think differently to solve the challenging task ahead of us. We consider CCS an important long-term measure for reducing the CO2 emission globally. We have been developing CCS since the early 1990s and played an important role in getting CCS to where it is today. We are engaged in building a European value chain that will capture and store CO2 from third-party industrial sites. And together with our partners Total and Shell, we have decided to invest in the Northern Lights project for CO2 storage on the Norwegian continental shelf. And renewable projects are continuously added to our portfolio, with 4 offshore wind parks in full operation in the UK and in Germany. We are also developing opportunities in several other countries. And last summer, we won the auction to develop the Empire Wind Park outside New York City and the Dogger Bank outside UK, together with our partner SSE. These projects combined will produce energy to power the equivalent of 5 million homes. Even if a low carbon future, there will be a need for oil and gas. We need to apply technology to produce the oil and gas with the lowest possible carbon footprint. And around 80 to 85% of CO2 emission from our operated fields comes from turbine activity, pumps and compressors. Designing and producing our fields in an energy efficient way is a key enabler for Equinor's ambition to reduce upstream CO2 emission. By predicting energy use and CO2 emission, we can optimize our drainage strategies and the facility construction for high production and low emissions. We plan to use this technology on all operated fields in production. I also want to mention our recent investments in fusion energy, which has nearly unlimited fuel supply without emitting CO2 or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This is a potential game-changing zero carbon energy technology that could be used by the early 2030s. So to sum up today, We need a transition away from fossil fuels, but also a transition within fossil energy to transform our energy system. We have already been working on carbon reducing measures for many years and have a project portfolio that reflect our commitment to provide energy to the world now and in a low carbon future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anders Opedal, for that interesting insight in the carbon reducing activities that you have at Equinor. And it's good to see that now you have your headset on, so you're ready for some questions, I hope. And first of all, I would like to know, because you mentioned that the importance of experts joining forces and working together for the transition. To what extent do you at Equinor use that external expertise when you're working with your new technology projects?
Well, I mentioned a little bit in the speech as well. What kind of black swans or new technologies will be available to disrupt kind of the current energy we are providing to our customers? So we're trying by participating with, discussing with events like this, technical, events, technology, being part of venture funds, etc., trying to be really out there, understanding what are the dynamics that's happening at the moment in the technology space, but also both in its supply space and demand space and so on. So I think we had the kind of the breadth of some of these views already being discussed in this webinar.
And also, speaking of breadth, you mentioned that Equinor is developing into a broad energy company. And I read that you have a plan, not you personally, but Equinor have a plan on sharing, on having a share of renewable projects of 15 to 20% of your total investments by 2030. Now, is that sufficient for the transition that has to be made?
Well, if it's sufficient then for the whole society, I'm not sure, but at least this is
and urbanization
we can work with. Is to get the access to actually new areas where we can develop renewable energy. That is one thing, and then is also to bring this forward to project execution, joining in with the supply chain and so on, and also then building the necessary competence within the company and utilize the competencies already in the supply chain. So so we are actually planning to increase quite a lot the installed capacity by 2025-26 and even further towards 2030.
And the audience, they are asking about approximately the same thing, saying that you're actually planning on then, if you flip the numbers around, you're planning on still investing 80% then in fossil energy. And how is that applicable to the Paris Agreement? That is one question and one reaction. But at the same time, I've heard that Equinor is actually amongst the most forward-leaning energy companies in the world when it comes to going from oil and gas towards renewables. How is all this put together in a way?
Well, we have set a very clear ambition for the company, and as a part of the strategy, low carbon is a part of that strategy, and that means that we are working actively now to shape our portfolio such that we can take down
civilization, global carbon
of the energy we are producing, and we actually put a target to reduce that by 50% by 2050. Oil and gas projects been around for a while. There's a big system, and when you're starting and investing in a new revenue stream, in the first years, it will always kind of not be very much big compared to the core business. But we have a very clear target of increasing our renewables in investments, and it will be a sizable part of our business. And if you compare it with other companies, our renewable business is quite a substantial business.
There are several questions from the audience, and we don't really have time to go in depth on all of them now, but you're going to join us as well for the panel discussion. But this one, because you mentioned CCS as, you know, a big part of everything that you're doing. We need negative emissions to reach the 2050 target. Is there a risk that large-scale investments in CCS can hinder the development of negative emissions technologies?
Well, I'm not sure. You know, I think, you know, generally speaking, I think we need all the technology we need. I don't think we should try to put different types of technology, low carbon technology, up against each other. I've seen there has been some attempt for green and blue hydrogen, and also now this one. I think the world need all the technology we can in terms of low carbon emission. Low carbon technology, and that's why we are focusing so much on the Northern Light project, which is actually putting together a full value stream of you know, picking up CO2 from some emission points in the eastern part of Norway, bringing them to the western part of Norway by ship, and then pipe it into the Norwegian continental shelf and down in the reservoir for permanent storage, to create a value chain there where we can make this a business. We need a support from the government to do it in the first. We have all the technology available to do so, but now is really finding much more cost-efficient technology so we can drive down the cost and make sure that this is a value chain where we can make money, and you know, that's why we are in there. At the same time, we are able to reduce the CO2 emission of the world.
But this is not actually happening today. You're not putting CO2 into the ground as yet.
We do that already from 2 producing fields, Sleipner and Snøhvit. And for the Northern Light, we have taken an investment decision inside Equinor, and we're waiting for the government to give an approval.
Improving energy efficiency.
We have already drilled the well. We named it an exploration well. This is actually the first exploration well. We hoped not to find oil and gas, because we wanted it to be just very good sandstone so we can inject a lot of CO2. So the well is ready, but the rest of the facilities and the pipelines needs to be built.
Yeah. Anders, I'm looking a little bit at Slido now, and I also want to ask the experts if they would like to interrogate you a little bit before we move on. So there we have Franziska. So now I'm actually going to say, Franziska, you're the only one of the 2 experts. Sorry, Reinhard. You can come back for the panel discussion, because
no problem.
Time is running so quickly. So Franziska, your question to Anders.
Thank you, Ruth. And I very much like your provocative question if the renewable target of Equinor is actually sufficient. My impression is rather that Equinor is sort of a front runner among the oil and gas companies. And I wonder if there is still sort of an effective cooperation with other oil and gas companies. There was something like a Gas for Climate cooperation a few years ago, but we hear relatively little from oil and gas companies these days. Beyond Petroleum was a long time ago. Are you able to pull your competitors to also move in a low carbon direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And to just, since I mentioned the Northern Light project in the CCS, I would like to mention that Total and Shell, they are co-investors in this together with Equinor and the Norwegian government. So both Total and Shell and Equinor, we share the same view on the CCUS and really would like to drive this to be a business for us. So I would say that there is a lot of cooperation. We're actually using a little bit of the cooperation model we use in normal oil and gas projects, with one operator and then partners, and you know, bringing together the partners for making investments, and
one among the many or 2 among
of the cost to bring those projects forward.
Thank you so far, people. I know that you're just eager to keep on talking to Anders, and you're going to get the chance to do so. And I see also the audience is pretty eager in asking different kinds of questions when it comes to the oil and gas industry. So now we're going to say goodbye to the 3 of you for a couple of minutes. And our next speaker, she's happy to see that the debate about climate change and environmental challenges is present worldwide and continuously evolving. But she is afraid that the pace of the transition is too slow and that we're still not doing enough. Therese Hugstmyr Woie is head of Nature and Youth in Norway, and she will now share her perspective.
But
both the oil and gas industry and Norway as an oil exporting country have. So please, Therese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to share my screen to show the.
I think that in order to have a cost-efficient.
Do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you. My name is Therese Woie, as she said. And here you see a picture of our organization protesting a mining project in Norwegian mountains where they want to dump mining waste into a fjord. And this has nothing to do with fossil energy exactly, but it is one of the more interesting things in this debate. I think how are we going to end fossil fuels while not having too big impacts on nature? So this is a mine where they wanted to or mine for copper and rutile in 2 different mines. So first, who is Natur og Ungdom? We are Young Friends of the Earth Norway, and the biggest environmental organization here. And we work in local groups all over the country to put the responsibility to the politicians and work with both climate and nature and environment all over the country. And I will start with Norwegian oil, of course. This is us in 2019 when we just had one of our biggest projects to stop oil drilling in Lofoten, or prevent oil drilling in Lofoten, Vesterålen, and Senja. And this was a big win because before it was almost unthinkable to put a stop to oil interests that wanted to get into an area. But it was also a feeling of hopelessness because why are we protesting new areas to be opened for oil when we know that 2/3 of what we've already found of oil, gas, and coal has to stay in the ground if we will have any chance to stay below 1.5 degrees warming? So we have a lot of more oil than we can burn. Even if all the coal stayed in the ground, we couldn't burn all the oil and gas we already have found. So it feels hard to have to protest new areas for oil drilling. And this is, of course, one of the reasons. It's a carbon budget that you've seen many times, where to the left you can see reserves already known, developed, and that if suddenly all the coal was to stay in the ground, we still can't use all the oil and gas. So that puts Norwegian oil politics into perspective. So it's a really big gap between plans and what's possible. So Norway keeps looking for new oil reserves, and we are moving into more and more valuable areas. We managed to stop the oil industry from entering Lofoten, where the really valuable fishing resources are, but we just had a debate in Norway about Norwegian oil in the Arctic, where we didn't manage to put a line further south on where it's allowed to drill for oil. Yeah, so what's important here also is it's not always the economy that's the reason to go into these new areas. It's also just the wish to prolong the fossil area, and I will get back to that. But yes, so this is an important graph for us. You see, Norway is one of the 7 biggest exporters of fossil fuels, And this is actually 10 times more the emissions from what we export than what we have as Norwegian emissions. And that is one of the reasons why we are taking
by 2025
into court in the climate lawsuit. Because Norway is part of the problem here. The fact that we are exporting a lot of oil prevents the green transition. If we had exported less oil and gas, it would be used a little bit less oil and gas, and that would be an important contribution, and also a very important signal that it's possible for a big economy that's dependent on exportation of fossil fuels to transition to greener industries. And the climate lawsuit that I hope many have heard about is about these new oil licenses in far north in Norway. And we say that the constitution of Norway that says that each person has the right to a healthy environment, and that the state is responsible for this future environment. We mean that when we open new areas for oil drilling in the Arctic, that both is risky for the nature and is more than the climate can handle when it's burned, then the government is breaking that right. So we haven't won the court case yet, but we have appealed to the Supreme Court, and we'll meet the government there in the 4th of November this year. And then a little bit, back to this. It's just a summary of what happened in the court case. The court actually says that we have the right to a healthy environment, and the state has a responsibility. And there's a limit to how bad the state can be on climate. But the Arctic oil or the licenses that we have gone to court for isn't big enough. But we hope the Supreme Court will see it differently. And then a bit more about Norway's responsibility. I think Norway is a good example because we have all the possibilities that many countries doesn't have, but still we don't manage to get our emissions down. And a lot of that is important because of the fossil industry exporting oil and gas that has increasing emissions. And also we have almost 100% renewable electric power, and that the rest of the world doesn't have. And that shows that even when we get 100% renewable electric power in the world, there's still a big job left. And Norway has to show the way and show that we can do it. But now we are just really slow and just happy with being as good as we are now, instead of improving and showing a way for the world. Here I summed up some of the things that we think is really important to talk about, and that is that it's a lot of talk about new technologies that can reduce emissions in the future and so on, but we have to do what we can now. We have delayed this process so long that we have to cut all the fossil energy that we can now, while we're waiting for CCS and all that. And it's really important to remember that we have to reduce the demand of energy also. If countries are going to rise up from poverty and get electricity and so on, we actually have to travel less with plane, exchange cars and planes with trains that's more energy efficient and all that, so that we don't increase the demand for energy too much when we go through our green transition. And that is a perspective that we think is way too little talked about. And it's also really important if we're going to have a transition that doesn't have a too big impact on nature and the use of resources, then we have to have a big focus on reducing our consumption and energy demand. And we also have to plan as if the rest of the world is going to meet the climate goals, because now it's sort of a way that everyone is waiting and saying we can't go all in the green transition unless all countries do it, unless we can see that there's a chance that China is going to end coal, then we can't go all in. But that when we know what we know about how short time there's left to do what's necessary, then we have to do everything we can now, and then it's really risky to put all our eggs into one basket that is waiting for technologies and hoping that we can keep up with business as usual. So yeah, we have to talk about not building roads over where we can produce food, for example. It's not enough to have all electric cars when it's the increasing amount of cars that's also a big problem, for example. So the time goes really fast, but to end this, this is a climate strike we had in Norway in 2019. It was more than 40,000 youth all over Norway that had 3 demands, and 2 of them were no new oil licenses in Norway and cut Norwegian emissions down with 55% of our own emissions. This was more people gathered than we have ever dreamed about in our organization, but yet they weren't listened to, and Norway has handed out more oil licenses and not gotten good enough climate goals after that. So it's not enough to mobilize a lot of people to make this transition good enough. We also need to put action into those words from us protesters, and we need local action groups all over the country and all over the world that protest every decision that contributes to a future that depends still on fossil fuels. It's not enough to say, of course we do it in the climate lawsuit, we just say this is not good enough, you have to find another way, and also other climate lawsuits all over the world has, for example, judged Netherlands to increase their climate goals, but we also need to protest all the decisions that contributes to a future with fossil fuels. Because we really think today there has to be more restrictions on prolonging the lifespan of fossil fuels. The argument that we will need some fossil fuels in the future if we have CCS and everything, that's not a good reason to not put restrictions on fossil fuels today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Therese, for addressing the dilemma that Norway is quite well known for having on one side a huge oil and gas production, and on the other side being a very resourceful country when it comes to renewable resources as well. Now, as you pointed out, time is running very, very quickly today, and I'm not too worried though, because we do have the time until 4 o'clock. But I would like to convey some of the questions from the audience to you. And one of them is more general. So if oil and gas production in Norway is to end, how does the country then create value to its inhabitants? Who will provide the jobs and from there income to people?
Yeah, Norway is an extremely resourceful country, not only in fossil fuels from oil and gas. There's so many values that we can use better. And as we see now, it's not all, while we still earn a lot from our oil and gas exportation, of course, we see that when it when oil and gas hits hard times during Corona, as we learned today also, and the oil price gets really low, the Norwegian government actually gives big subsidies to the oil industry so that projects will be more will earn more than they rather would have in the form of tax releases. And that just shows that we don't have a correct view on how to use opportunities for transition, and that sometimes the wish to keep jobs in the supply industry actually can be a bit against its purpose, because we delay the transition that we anyway need to other industries, and we have great resources in fisheries and in green shipping and so on, and we can use technologies from oil companies, as Equinor explained today, in CCS and hydrogen and offshore wind parks and so on. But it doesn't go fast enough, even though Equinor has some strategies. It doesn't help as long as we still push so much on prolonging the lifespan of fossil fuels.
But are you talking about a phase out of the Norwegian oil and gas industry in Nature and Youth? I mean, do you set a date for this?
No, we haven't set a date. We have said no new areas.
No new areas.
No new licenses.
So, Therese, as we were pointing out, the time is running quickly, and I was cutting off Reinhard, one of our experts, earlier on, so I'm going to give him a chance to ask you a question if he wants to. So we'll see if Reinhard is going to be on camera. There he is. So Reinhard, do you have a question for Therese?
Yes, Therese, one question that bothers me is, do you think enough money from your Norwegian super fund is being channeled into the sustainable energy transition these days?
Of course, no. I think we could have used this tremendous amount of money. That's really, yeah. It's not many countries that has the same opportunity to put speed into the transition with such a big pension fund. And I think we made there were a lot of divestment campaigns a lot of years ago about getting the oil fund out of coal and oil and gas industry. And just that has taken so much time. Just this year, it was actually made clear that we're actually going to retrieve our pension fund out of oil and gas projects. So that has been a big enough job, and I definitely think that we should use it more actively now that we are out of fossil fuels, to put the money into where it needs to be if we actually believe that renewable energy are going to be, or what we depend on the most in the future. Then that's definitely where our money should be spent now.
I think the crux of my question is it possible to invest more money today to leave a better world tomorrow? Because then the future generations will need less. And if we don't manage that, then the future generations will not appreciate that you have not left them more money to deal with the problems that are postponed into the future.
Yeah, I think it's important never to forget that the more we delay the big transition and the big action to end fossil fuels, the more expensive that job will be in the future. So our generation doesn't want to be left with that job. A big pension fund maybe, but a lot bigger bill and costs other than economical costs on making that transition. So I definitely think that we need to spend money now while it's possible to prevent the worst climate change, and also while it will be more expensive in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Yeah, thank you, Reinhard, and thank you to Therese as well. You're both going to join us again later on in the discussion, because now we're going to travel to Asia. Dr. Xavier Chen, normally we would stop in China to meet Xavier Chen, the president of the Beijing Energy Club, a high-level forum and think tank on Chinese and global energy issues. However, Dr. Xavier Chen is currently corona-stuck in Thailand, maybe not the worst place to be though, and from where he sits, the world of energy looks a bit different from the typical European position. Now, he knows both positions well, being an experienced professional both in Chinese and in global energy industry, with more than 30 years on his CV. So I'm going to leave to him to elaborate and to explain why he thinks fossil fuels will be around and is in use as long as there are humans on Earth. And you can, of course, challenge him through Slido with the same code as we've had so far, 41647. So calling up Thailand, I know you're there already. Xavier Chen, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ruth, dear friends. Part of my experience was Norway related, because I was head of Equinor for China office during almost 5 years. So I know all the Norwegian discussions about the future of fossil fuel. So looking from Asia, I would say, the answer to the question is very simple. Yes, fossil fuel has a future. Let me show you with 2 slides to illustrate my point. Next slide, please. So where are we today? If we use the BP statistical review of world energy last year, we see that the fossil fuels today account for almost 85%. Non-fossil fuels, including nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, geothermal, they account for 15.3%. So the world is still dominated by fossil fuel. And then on the right chart, you can see that the share of non-fossil fuels from 1980 to 2018 grew, from 9.4% to 15.3%. So over 38 years, only 6.9% growth, averaging every year a little bit further, 0.18% a year. So very slow, but the good news is that the acceleration is happening. So in last 8 years, starting from 2010, the growth rate was to 0.28%, so a little bit faster. So that's good news. Let me show you, the point that we need to decarbonize, but these non-fossil fuels each has its problems. Do you want to have nuclear power in your backyard? Nuclear power has safety concerns, and most importantly, the radioactivity issue. When a nuclear power retired, and when the nuclear power plant is retired, and there is no solution yet how to treat the radioactive waste. Hydropower is clean, but in many parts of the world, hydropower also causes ecological concerns. Solar, wind, geothermal are clean, yet solar power is intermittent, and wind is also intermittent. And furthermore, solar and wind, their energy density is not very high. So, and you have also visual impacts for both solar and wind projects. So my point here is that even non-fossil fuels, no fuel is perfect fuel. Every fuel has its problems and limitations. So next slide, please. So this second slide shows that replacing oil is not an easy task. Look at the left chart. Where oil is consumed, 22% of oil is consumed in passenger cars. Trucks consume more. Trucks and buses consume more oil than cars. And then you have aviation, shipping, railways, power generation, buildings for heating, industrial for driving forces, and also petrochemicals. They consume majority part of oil. And then petrochemicals are very, very important. Statistics show that in every person during his or her life, we eat about 550 kilograms of oil, because in many of the things that we eat, it has oil products. The T-shirt I wear has also oil products. And in my life, in average life of a world citizen, we wear 290 kilograms of oil. And we use in my house, the curtain behind me, the computer, keyboard, and all has oil content. Yeah, so in average person's life, we use 3,790 kilograms, almost 4 tons of oil in housing and in daily lives. And then transportation, of course, is also a big amount of oil that we use, not only in the cars we drive, in the buses we take, in aviation, and also in the roads, because all the roads are paved with bitumes. So we in transportation, we consume around 3,900 kilograms of oil. So altogether, non-transportation sector oil consumption is bigger than the transportation sector. Non-transportation sector consumes in average person's life 4.6 tons of oil, whereas the transportation sector is only 3.8 tons. So I know that you have very high expectations on EVs, because Norway is the most attractive markets for electric vehicles. And EVs are most popular because you provide a lot of subsidies and government support, and charging free, parking free, tollways free. And EVs are also very visible in the streets of big Chinese cities. But I come to Chiang Mai very often, a beautiful northern city of Thailand. There is no single EV. I've been visiting this city for last 10 years. And even these days, I travel to the city very often. I have not seen a single EV in this city. Then if you look at the right chart, right part of this slide, today we have about 1.4 billion cars around the world. And there are 5 million EVs. So the share in the car fleet of EVs is only 0.37. And then the Chinese number looks a little better. China has 3.44 million EVs by end of 2018 against the car fleet of 250 million. So the share is 1.4%. And this may be accelerating in the coming years because more and more EVs are stored and the percentage are higher every year. So in 2019, China as a country sold 25.8 million cars, and of which 1.2 million are EVs. So it's 4.6% in the total share. So if you look at this picture, so the most feasible sector to replace oil in transportation is passenger cars, 22%. But then these passenger cars are again dominated by oil-fueled vehicles. Electric vehicles are very tiny. So oil will be there in the foreseeable future, in particular for petrochemicals, oil as a feedstock. So my view is that so long as human beings live in this earth, this planet, we will still need fossil fuels. That's the reality that we are living in this world. The next slide. So the last slide I want to share with you is related to my experience working in the International Energy Agency, because I worked there 8 years. So the IEA always said that the energy sector mission is to ensure energy security while protecting the environment and in a most economic efficient way. So energy security means universal access to secure, sustainable, affordable, and reliable supply of energy. So what's happening, as I see, in Europe and also in many parts of this world, in particular in China, now we are shifting from energy security focused mode of operation to environmental security focused mode of operation for the entire energy industry, from production to consumption. So environmental security is at the core of energy transition, with the condition that we can ensure energy security and also in a most competitive way. And then I would say that with the development of technologies, innovation, in particular the digital technologies, I see these 7 Ds are driving the global energy transition. The first one is diversification, with more and more energy sources and technology means. Second is decarbonization, that everybody knows. I'm happy to see young people like Therese, very active in carbon emission fighting, to reduce carbon emissions, to mobilize people. And then digitalization, deregulation of the energy markets to free up the market forces, decentralization, from a more centralized energy supply to a more decentralized along the homes, factories, districts, and democratization. More and more consumers are given the choice of energy supply. And lastly, depollution, very, very relevant for major parts of Asia. So these things are really, from what I see, driving the global energy transition with environmental security, including climate change, as the heart of the energy sector's mission. So before ending, I just want to make one brief comment. Norway is the world leader in clean energy, and Statoil or Equinor is doing a lot. I'm very happy to hear from Anders Opedal that Equinor is also investing in fusion energy. But to young people like Therese, I would say that you are very fortunate in a very clean and low carbon country already. And then, you know, we need time to accelerate energy transition. There is an urgency for climate protection. At the same time, energy system has its inertia, and it's not easier to change overnight. For example, I say there's no single EV in this beautiful city of Chiang Mai of 1 million permanent residents here. But then how can you ask people to when the entire electricity system is not reliable? If there is a storm here, there is a power shortage. So you need to build a very strong power system before you can encourage people to shift to EVs. And then, of course, you know, Norway is very, very important in leading the global transition to clean energy, even to reduce the CO2 emissions. And also, you know, I would say that the 2 points for your consideration. One is that the total Norwegian CO2 emission is only 0.35% of the total Chinese emission. So Norway alone cannot save the planet. We need to leverage Norwegian experiences, technologies, know-how, skills to work together with other countries, in particular the big emitters like China, to reduce emissions. So that's the very first point that I want to make. And then second is that if you are living in a country where there is no secure supply of electricity and with no fuel for heating, what would you choose to do? So fossil fuels still has a future in a way that they are abundant, and then they can provide reliable and affordable energy. What we need to do is to reduce the energy consumption, and also to the extent possible to make fossil fuels more efficient, and to the extent possible also reduce all the fossil fuel related emissions, and keep the fossil fuels for generations and generations come for the chemical feedstock. So fuels should not be burned in the future, but they should be processed and produced as products for our long living in this planet. So I will stop here and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. I don't know if you realized, but you were sort of entering the discussion already without anyone to discuss with. So I was almost jumping in there to stop you, but it's okay. So I think, because there are several questions for you actually, so if you promise to answer me shortly on a couple of them, I can bring them forward. Now, the first one is, in 1993, the world had 1% of mobile phone coverage. Nowadays, we have almost 100%. Can we ignore the power of exponential growth in energy?
Yeah, Ruth, that's a good question. Let me point out the difference between information technology and energy technology. So information cheats, technology cheats with information, with digital. So digital is non-material. We do not, need a huge amount of materials to support the communication. So information by itself, I share information with you, but I still keep the information. I can share with 1 million people, but I still keep it. but energy belongs to the material world. There is the conservation, and energy needs to be connected physically so that it can be delivered. So the energy infrastructure is rigid. It involves heavy investment. It has the path dependency. So energy world cannot follow the telecommunication world to change overnight very quickly. So the energy transition will take much longer time than the mobile phone distribution.
Revolution. Yeah. You know what? I'm going to save the other questions for you for the panel, and that goes for the experts as well. So we're going to wait with them, put them on hold. So I'm going to say goodbye and thank you for now to you, Xavier, Chen, and you will be back in 10-15 minutes actually to join the panel discussion, and we're closing in on 4 o'clock. So bye for now. Thank you very much. I know that you have a lot to contribute with into the panel discussion. So that was the Asian perspective. Now let's hear it from the US. According to numbers from the EIA, which is the US Energy Information Administration, 80% of the energy consumption in 2019 was based on fossil fuels. And the emissions from the North American continent are substantial and increasing. Dr. David Daniels is the Chief Energy Modeler at the EIA, working to ensure internal consistency across the agency's energy models. His main priority is to provide solid knowledge so that sound policies can be carved out. He's now going to share some of his knowledge with us, and I wonder if he sees any change ahead as the sun now rises above Washington, D.C. David, the screen is all yours.
Hello. I'd like to thank the organizers of the NTNU Energy Transition webinar series, both for putting the series on, and if you've missed the previous entry in the series, I encourage you to go look at the recordings from that and stay tuned for future installments. And also for inviting me to share some of the EIA data here with you today on the future of fossil energy. I hope to bring a little bit of a US perspective to this. I work for the US Energy Information Administration, which is a part of the US, an independent statistical agency within the US government. We're responsible for collecting and publishing information on the energy system in the US and abroad, and for publishing projections. All the data that I'll be showing here today comes from EIA data. Now, before I show you the data, I have a couple of caveats. The first is that everything I will show you is from publications that we produced pre-COVID. So none of the pandemic responses are incorporated into the information I'll be sharing with you today. Also, that the EIA reference case, which is mostly what I'll be talking about today, is not a forecast for the future. It's not a prediction of what's going to come. It is a projection, that's what we call it, which is meant to be a kind of a baseline against which to measure change. So if we're seeking to measure change, we can't put the change into the baseline. So specifically, we have no new laws or regulations. The laws and regulations that are on the books, we assume stay on the books as written. There are no extensions or no additional laws or regulations. And there are no technology breakthroughs. So no new shale revolutions, no new breakthroughs in battery technologies or CCS or hydrogen fuel cells or any of those things. Now, we know that there will be new laws and regulations, and we're monitoring the discussions that are happening right now. People are talking about extending the subsidies for wind and solar production. We know about those things, and as soon as they're passed, we will incorporate them. But we don't put them in the reference case. We also know about technologies. We're monitoring those as well. We see that there's a lot of R&D being spent. Some of those investments will pay off, presumably, with technology breakthroughs. But until they happen, they aren't incorporated in our reference case. So the reference case becomes a baseline against which to measure the change from when these things happen. So the quote from Charles Dickens, this is Ebenezer Scrooge, right? When he's visited by the spirit of Christmas yet to come, and he asks, and he's given a vision of the future, and he asks the spirit, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Well, the EIA reference case is absolutely shadows of things that may be only. And in fact, they're not even very likely. So here's, in a nutshell, the future of fossil fuels in the US. This isn't consumption, this is actually energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, but it's a useful place to look at the future for fossil fuels. EIA only projects forward through 2050. So everything you'll see in here goes through 2050 and stops. We don't say anything about what happens beyond that because we haven't analyzed it. Fossil fuel emissions, the left-hand side shows emissions from different sectors. The right-hand side shows the fuels that do the emitting. I want you to notice two things about these charts. The first is if you added up all the emissions, you would get about 5 billion metric tons in 1990. That would grow to about 6 billion metric tons by the mid-2000s. I think the peak was in 2007, and then it declines. By 2020, it's expected to be back where it was in 1990, 30 years ago, 5 billion metric tons. And we're continuing to decrease in emissions, but EIA projects that that decrease will come to a slow stop around 2030 or so, and then start to increase again. By 2050, we're almost back to 5 billion metric tons. So the first thing to notice is that 1990, 2020, and 2050, from an emissions standpoint, look very similar, about 5 billion metric tons. So one answer to the question of is there a future for fossil fuels is that, well, yes, without any additional action being taken, 2050 looks an awful lot like today, and that looks an awful lot like 1990. The second thing to notice about these is that some of the shapes on the left and the right are very similar. Transportation looks very similar to petroleum. That smile shape in the future is very interesting, and I would love to go into that, but that would take up all the additional time that I have here today. Electric power looks a lot like coal. Well, that's no wonder. In the US, coal is predominantly burned for the production of electricity. The growth in the industrial sector on the left-hand side matches the growth in natural gas consumption on the right-hand side. Again, natural gas is used very heavily in the industrial sector. So I want to go into two other stories here. One is on natural gas. I want to talk about that one a little bit, and then I want to talk about electric power because the shapes of those two are pretty interesting. One increasing, one decreasing, and then staying kind of flat. The natural gas story is a supply story. Here we have natural gas production from the US on the left. And we can see that historically, if you had extended this backward in time, you'd see a long, slow decline in natural gas production, hitting its nadir in the mid-2000s. 2005, natural gas production was about 18 trillion cubic feet. By 2019, it was up to about 35 trillion cubic feet, almost doubled in about 15 years. EIA projects that natural gas production will continue to grow throughout the projection period through 2050. The rate of growth will slow down, won't be as fast as it's been in the last 10 years, but it will continue to grow. And this despite historically low prices. The right-hand side shows the natural gas spot price at Henry Hub, and you can see that historically it's been in the range of, $5 to $10 per MMBTU. And these are annual average prices. This is not a short-term fluctuation because of a spike in the weather or something like that. This is an annual average price. Today, that price is around $2 per MMBTU. And EIA projects that although it will grow slowly into the future, it'll never actually get back, not through 2050, it won't get back to even $4 per MMBTU. That level of price is historically very, very low. And yet, despite that low price, we still have production growing. So what that means is in the US, we are now in a world with very low and abundant, low price and very abundant natural gas. Well, wait a second, I hear you say, what about renewables? What about wind and solar? Sure, your natural gas prices are low, but they're increasing over time. Wind and solar costs are declining. Shouldn't they beat out natural gas? Well, that's an electricity story. So let's look at electricity now. The left-hand side shows the production of electricity in the US by source. And you can see that renewables are in fact growing the fastest. They're doubling in their share from 19% to 38% over the projection period. And the right-hand side shows the breakdown of those renewables into the different types. You can see that almost all of the growth is in fact wind and solar. Now there's a couple of things to notice about this chart as well. First, that wind and solar growth, although there are state and local mandates for shares of wind and solar, the growth that we're projecting exceeds those shares. We produce about twice as much wind and solar as is required by state level mandates. So what that means is that wind and solar are coming in economically. They're coming in because they're cheap, not because they're required to come in. They come in, they're about 80% of total renewables, that's the right-hand side. 80% of the 38% on the left-hand side is about a third. So wind and solar is about a third, makes up about a third of generation by 2050. Yet, even with that growth, if you look at the non-renewables, the total generation from non-renewables in 2050 is almost exactly where it was in 2020. So renewables, with all of that growth, is essentially keeping up with the demand growth for electricity in the US, but it's not pushing out other sources of generation. Now, this differs from other places in the world. Let me show you two others as an illustrative example. First is OECD Europe. If you look at the right-hand side, the top of those bars, you can see that the growth in electricity demand in OECD Europe is relatively low. It's about the same as the US. The left-hand side of this is the US. The right-hand side of this is OECD Europe. So demand is very similar. Wind and solar share in OECD Europe is growing faster than it is in the US. By 2050, it gets to about a half. Remember, in the US, it was about a third. In OECD Europe, it's about a half. So with similar demand growth, but larger share of renewables, you can see that on the right-hand side of this chart, renewables, wind and solar, are pushing out essentially the fossil fuels. That's the big difference between OECD Europe and the US. But compare OECD Europe now with India. India's share of wind and solar also starts at relatively modest levels and also grows to about half of generation, taking share from, in this case, coal. Yet on the right-hand side, the growth of electricity demand is so much higher in India that even though it loses share, coal's total amount of generation more than doubles between 2020 and 2050. The difference, obviously, between OECD Europe and India is the level of demand growth. So net-net, when renewables grow, in some regions they push out fossil fuels, in other regions they don't. And the big difference, other than the rate of renewables growth, is the rate of energy demand growth, essentially. If you put all this at the global level, we find that this is the global primary energy consumption. If you look at the left-hand side, you see that renewables are growing faster than any other source. And by 2050, they become the #1 source of primary energy. They're the primary energy source. Yet, they don't grow fast enough to prevent the growth of other forms of energy, including fossil fuels. Now, I don't mean to say any of these things to discourage anyone. We had a president about 60 years ago who said, to state the facts frankly is not to despair the future nor indict the past. I don't mean to despair the future. But like Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, we are given the opportunity to see one vision of the future. This is one vision of the future if we didn't make any change. We now have the opportunity, like Scrooge did, to make change. I thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that glimpse into the future as you see it in the US. And I was a bit intrigued by one thing that you said, that renewable sources and I think it was when it comes to electricity production, that it does not push out fossil fuels in electricity generation, to be precise. Whereas that happens in Europe and in other parts of the world. How do you explain that? Why is that happening? Is it because people are using more energy than they should, or what is it?
I don't know about more energy than they should, but as I said in the talk just a minute ago, whether renewables growth alone is sufficient to drive down the generation from non-renewables depends on two things: how much renewables grows, We saw the difference there between OECD Europe and the US, where OECD Europe was growing faster than the US. So obviously you'd expect it to have more of an impact on the non-renewables. And the other thing was growth in electricity demand. So both in the OECD, in the developed part of Europe and most of North America, in fact, electricity demand growth is relatively low. In a lot of other parts of the world, the developing world, electricity demand is growing very, very fast. So there, the requirements for renewables to be the way that fossil fuels decline in share, the bar is much higher for renewables. They would have to grow faster than demand growth, but demand is growing very, very fast. So it makes it a very challenging job for renewables alone to do.
But you also mentioned that in the States, the electricity production is higher than the mandates. I think you mentioned actually demand. Wouldn't that tell us that there is a huge potential for more generation and production?
Well, what it says is that there is a lot of potential, and EIA is projecting that a lot of that potential will be satisfied with additional wind and solar. The point of that is that the mandates themselves, depending on how you look at it, are either not very ambitious or not very complete. These are state and local mandates, right? So this is a patchwork, a kind of a quilt of different regulations at the state and local level, because there's no national level mandate in the US. There are some national level incentives that I referred to briefly. They're slated to ramp down in the short term. If those are extended, right, then one of the implications is if wind and solar are coming in for economic reasons and you extend economic incentives, then you would expect those incentives to have an impact. If the opposite had been true, if the reason we're building wind and solar is simply to meet slated mandates, but they're out of the money, let's say, then making them slightly more in the money by extending federal tax credits, for instance, to them, might or might not have any impact on how much they grow.
Right. So this is something I guess that both our experts and maybe parts of the rest of the presentation or presenters might be interested in discussing. And I think we're going to jump on to the panel discussion now. So thank you, David. And please just stay online. Do not turn your camera off, because now I'm going to invite all the presenters back again on screen so that we can engage in a panel discussion. And we have a tiny technical challenge because we have room for 6 webcams on at the same time. You guys are going to be 5 now, so I'll be turning my camera off. So I've done that now, so you can still hear me, I hope. What we're going to do is to re-invite, well, one of you at the time, actually, dear experts, either Franziska or Reinhard, can join at the same time, but I want you to be part of the discussion as well. So to start with, and thank you once again for very interesting and intriguing presentations, and also to the audience for good questions. But to start with, we all know that the world needs to cut its emissions, and that fossil fuels are a big source of these emissions. And when all of you actually say yes to the question, is there a future for fossil energy, that is based on projections and scenarios who are in turn reflecting on stated policies. Now, if I were to ask you the question, should there be a future for fossil energy, how will you respond then? I can see a couple of you are smiling, but I would like to address that to Anders Opedal from Equinor first. Should there be a future for fossil energy, Anders?
Yeah, definitely, because we are not able to replace all the energy by other sources at the moment. But you know, the way we produce fossil energy and the way we use it needs to change over time. Kind of natural gas maybe need to turn into hydrogen, combined with carbon capture and storage. And this is really because, and there are people that know more about economics than me in this panel here, but you know, that is really the driver for putting people out of poverty and kind of saying that, you know, we should not have any fossil fuels at all and just stop it. You know, will that really benefit the economical growth that we also depend on as well? And I also kind of one of the key questions I asking myself, and I don't know the answer to this, crisis, you really, what kind of role will energy play now to bring us back out of this downturn after the COVID-19, and how can energy actually help in that respect?
I guess you said you don't have the answers, or at least not all of them yourself, but you might have some perspectives on it. And while you're answering to that, I would challenge the rest of the panel to just show, an index if they want to comment on what you're saying. Otherwise, I will definitely have more questions for all of you. But don't be shy. Just lean forward and show me whenever you want to have the word. And also, just a tiny message to Franziska, who is not visible at the moment, turn your microphone on and just jump into the discussion whenever you want. I know that you're truly capable of doing that. So, Anders, would you like to elaborate?
Oh, sorry, I didn't catch the question there.
No, I said you said yourself that you don't have the answer to the big question, what is going to happen now after the COVID-19, but you might have some perspectives on it.
Well, I think to bring new renewable energy to the market, that is even more important than before. I think also stimulus packages should be actually used to bring more of that energy to the market, in addition to bringing like the tax package we had for the oil and gas business in Norway. And the main reason for bringing these gas tax packages in Norway is also to make sure that we have a supplier industry that are able to take part in this transition that we need to do, because it's a lot of competence, and I'm not sure we're talking about all the competence that is actually needed to do the energy transition. We need people that are able to build smart grids. We need people to be able to build all these wind parks, to make smart wind parks, etc. So we have a golden opportunity now, when we are restoring from the COVID-19 to really have a good discussions about how we can both increase renewable energy as well.
Yeah, Therese.
Yeah, to the first question about should there be fossil fuels in the future? I think it's important to say, of course not, because we should have begun this transition 30 years ago and developed solutions before, and not be in this crazy position where we have 10 years to reduce emissions with 50%. So, but today, of course, it's a big enough job to reduce emissions enough and keep just the fossil fuels that we absolutely need, and take carbon capture and storage into that. But to the discussion with Equinor about the way out of the corona crisis and the economic crisis following that, I think it's important to see that it's not just coronavirus that have made the oil price low. It's also other reasons, and there will be other reasons than that in the future. And I think it's a really scary pathway to go down to say that we are willing to subsidize or give tax relief first when oil prices are down. And I don't think the way to save competence and supply industry jobs is to make it profitable to open new oil and gas projects. For example, in the Barents Sea, we don't need to develop the competence to develop oil industry in new areas further north and close to the ice edge zone and so on. We need to, it's completely other competence we need to develop, and that's opportunity that we're not using to the fullest now, that we are going to use enormous amount of money to make new jobs. So I think we are, the package from the government in Norway is too locked into keeping the new fossil projects. Yeah.
Thank you, Therese. So normally, if you were sat in a physical room, you would probably be more able to sort of jump on and just comment as we go along. But now I'm sort of steering this a little bit. I'm sorry to do that. Maria, I think I saw your index a couple of minutes ago. You're nodding. Yes, good. And I would like to give you the word, but I'll give you a question or two that hand over a question to you from the audience, which is now the trending question. What would happen if we stopped exploring for oil and gas and invested in alternatives? Would it accelerate the transition, or would it make it unstable or unjust?
Wow. So these are really, really interesting questions. We should have a nice dinner and some good wine to discuss this thing. I mean, it's just frustrating to have so little time.
Yes.
But first, let me comment on what Therese just mentioned. I think the issue or the question of whether we should have fossil or not, I think we should be focused on low carbon solutions. I don't see why we should not have that as, I mean, I am frustrated about the talks about renewables as the only option. I don't actually, I mean, we have some resources, we have some, and we need to find solutions. So let's focus on the low carbon solutions. They should be technology neutral, fuel neutral, but they should be low carbon. And that's that in my view. I don't see any problem of using any kind of raw materials if it's not affecting the environment, not affecting the climate, not making people poor, not having a social problem associated with it. So that's my kind of fundamental view on that, and that includes, of course, not exploring too far north, because that's of course a major problem. But that's part of the discussion about the environment in this context, in my view. Part of that would be interesting to discuss with you, Therese, is of course the use of EOR as part of CCS. Why not increase oil and gas production if that could reduce the chances of going further north? So that's also a very interesting discussion, I think. But to answer your very very difficult question. Obviously
overnight, but at the same time,
you are in some technologies will probably mean that you invest less in other technologies. I think globally we should think who are the world leaders. For example, for Europe, I'm part of this discussion in Brussels around what should be the focus for Europe. What should we do our research on, and what are Europe's specific competences? What are specific resources in Europe? So this should be taken into this discussion. I think it's not a global answer to this, but I think Asia do have some competitive edge, the same we do in Europe and US and so on. So I could spend more time elaborating on this, but I would like to leave the floor to others.
Thank you, Marie. I think, I'm not sure, did I hear you, Franziska, trying to get the word?
Not really, because my internet was a little down, so I didn't hear everything that Marie was saying. But I still, if I may, would like to jump in with a different topic.
Yeah, go ahead. On quite a lot of sectors.
Of coming back to investments in coal installations and coal infrastructure. Laszlo was mentioning that this is becoming increasingly difficult, and I wonder if the panel actually agrees with that, because the two last speakers didn't really sound like it to me. I mean, the recovery program in China, parts of it is investing in even more coal-fired power plants than were planned before. So that seems a very coal-intensive sort of long-term plan. And also, if I look at the EIA numbers in detail, which I happen to have done in the last months, I'm very puzzled by the stable coal use in electricity generation over time, which means that you will use your current coal-fired power plants for 80 or 90 years, or you have investments in new coal-fired power plants. And I wonder if the latter one really is an option, or the first one. So really my question is, do you think, or what does it, maybe you think that it's realistic to have new coal-fired power plants somewhere. And then the question is, what does it need to actually reduce that?
So are you addressing this to both Xavier, Chen, and to David
Definitely
Daniels?
David and Xavier in the first place, yes.
Yes. Okay,
Let me address the question about the U.S. coal quickly, because it's a specific question and it's a good question. First of all, there's no new coal in our projections in the U.S. We don't build any new coal capacity at all. The plateau that you see is legitimately there. We have rich discussions internally within the EIA about that coal plateau, let me tell you. But it's been very, very stable in the last several iterations of our annual energy outlook. And the short answer there is essentially as coal declines, you're shutting down the least efficient plants, the worst plants, the ones that are the least economic to run. What's remaining behind in the fleet are these extraordinarily efficient, relatively modern coal plants that are advantaged. In some cases, they have captive coal mines sitting next to them. They're very economically advantaged. And so without any kind of forcing function, a carbon price kind of a thing, which we don't have in nationally in the US, there's no reason economically to shut those plants down. They're essentially not being pushed out. They're not economic to build new coal, but to run the most efficient remaining plants, they're still economic to run.
Thank you, David. And Xavier, perspectives from China.
Yeah, so I think this question can also be combined with Anders' question about what will happen after coronavirus. So one thing that have been proven to be quite effective, actually, digital technologies, has been very helpful during the coronavirus crisis. Not only the online meetings, but also the digital proof of your health conditions. Everywhere, even in Thailand, I have to scan my cell phone to get into a supermarket, for example. So the Chinese government has put focus on stimulus package on this, what they call new infrastructure, essentially on digital technologies. And digital technologies are really, energy intensive, I would say. Data centers in China today consume more electricity than Shanghai city, entirely. So it's about 2% of total China electricity is consumed in the data centers. So, and also if you look at the future projection, one thing that stands out very clearly is that the share of electricity in the end uses will increase. And that's why, and China is also the only biggest, developing country has electricity access to all. Everybody has electricity access. So people see a very strong growth in electricity demand in the coming years. So that's why all energy sources for electricity generation will have to be mobilized. Not only coal, but also renewables, wind, solar, whatever. So this is and also including nuclear, by the way. So this is the Chinese approach of really ensuring security of power supply with all the sources. And of course, you have the climate change constraints, the Paris Agreement that China still stands for, to deliver the commitment. And then, of course, if you look at all the uses of coal, power supply is the area where you can have the highest efficiency of coal use. So more and more coal in the future, in China will be put into power generation, and then we have to find a way how to reduce both the local emissions and also CO2 emissions in the power sector. And some experiments are being carried out in terms of CCS or CCUS.
And how are you doing on that? Is there any progress that is actually viable?
No, not yet. Not yet viable. And not only, you have to find the storage sites, you have to find the financial mechanism to finance it, and you have to ensure the storage sites are safe. And remember to store CO2 there for 1,000 years, not a few years. So legal responsibility, and then all these issues, we have not yet found the business model for CCS.
Reinhard, you are now the one who's not visible, and I was just wondering, did you have any comments or questions for the panel before we move on and towards the end of the webinar? I can see that you are still there. Reinhard.
Now the micro's on. Sorry, I think the chairman had the micro off. Yeah, it was very good that we also touched on the consumer side, and it was good to see the situation in the US versus China versus India and Norway. But I wonder how we go about this without the political will to decarbonize. And I think it was most obvious for the US. Country seems to be divided whether decarbonization should happen. So it's not enough to just look at the supply side. We need to understand the consumers. We need the citizens, voters, having eventually power on the political will. And I see a lack of will in many countries nowadays. And even in Europe, in Germany, it's not for sure that we will achieve the targets that have been set. The supply side will react, whatever demand side and the political will set.
But is it not difficult to sort of decide for a will? I mean, the solutions have to be there, the money has to be there, the investors have to invest, you need some public acceptance, etc.
I think we're all impressed by the virus. We're all very impressed because it was imposed on from the outside. It was not our will as citizens or consumers. We were forced to change. And we are all now puzzled and positively amazed how well many things went, how we dealt with this crisis. I'm not sure how capable we will be to deal with the climate crisis if we just wait and let more and more time elapse.
Undesirable.
The clock is running, not just in this webinar, but overall. We cannot turn back the clock, and we are losing time in terms of decarbonization speed. Europe is having a higher pace, I think, and China maybe has a better political situation with a planned economy. They can be more effective because they're less dependent on the will to some extent of the citizens.
Reinhard, I think that you've in many ways summed up and also shown us the different dilemmas that we are facing. And I'm so sorry, because I did realize that some of you wanted to give a quick remark on that, but unfortunately we are closing up to 4 p.m. So I have to say thank you to the panel, thank you to the experts, and thank you also to the audience for participating. There will always be lots of questions that we don't have the time to answer, but I know that from the NTNU's side, part of the purpose of this series of webinars is precisely to get those discussions going. And I think we had many interesting perspectives here today. And before I say goodbye to all of you, I would like to remind you that the next webinar in the series will be already in a week, Tuesday, 23rd of June, from 9:30 to 12 Central European Standard Time. And the topic is game changers in the transition. So we're moving forward and seeing what else can we do and what can be done when the political will is lacking or anything else is hindering us in doing the transition. So once again, thank you very much to all of you, and in particular to the presenters and the experts for joining here today. And I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.